Hello, folks, and welcome. Let's wait a couple of minutes for everyone to join. So let me start sharing the screen. This is the second event in this series, Agile 201. And the idea behind this to go over the Agile fundamentals and recap together. So in the beginning, I will give a short, I will go through the slides, just presenting some basics about the current topic. And after that, we will switch to the lean coffee format. And let me send you the link to the Miro board, where you can actually add your topics for the discussion during the lean coffee. Today, our topic is user stories. And yeah, this is our agenda. Welcome, we're already through. So let's do a recap on the topic of user stories and then move on towards the lean coffee discussion. And again, here's the link to the Miro board. Let me paste it again for everyone who have just joined. Okay, so user stories are a usual familiar way of communicating the software requirements with the development team and also discussing the stakeholder needs. User stories are a convenient way to split the software into parts, describe it, and use user stories in prioritization and stakeholder conversations. Sometimes, quite often, actually, the term feature is used as a synonym to the user story. What is important to mind is that user stories are not detailed software requirements and are not a replacement for software requirements. So user stories are more like something like markers or titles of software features. They're always written in the language of the business, and they're used for referring to a certain feature, to a certain functionality of the software system, which is convenient when you need to discuss what has to be done, when you need to build roadmaps, when you need to prioritize with different stakeholders, and you need an easy way to refer to a certain chunk of functionality. So let's talk about the formats of the user stories. Of course, the one that you see now on the slide is the most familiar one. However, this is not the only possible way to write user stories. Sometimes this who, what, and why format can be really handy, and there are a couple of other formats that you can also use. One important part of the user story is specifying acceptance criteria. Acceptance criteria that can be used to understand whether the user story is implemented, which is very important for the development team. And that also can be used to align with the stakeholders what are the necessary parts of the user story to be delivered. So you can use the usual format of the story, which serves as a marker to the software feature, to this chunk of functionality, and also add the acceptance criteria to it. Acceptance criteria that can be that should pass a so-called binary test. So you should be always to answer yes or no to a question whether certain acceptance criteria was reached. Another interesting format of a user story of describing the acceptance criteria of a user story that is worth mentioning is the given, when, then format. And in some cases, it is pretty handy, especially when you're working on a technical side of a product. So, talking about splitting user stories, what is important to mind? Because probably this is one of the most tricky parts. How do you split your software? How do you split your product into the stories that are easy to understand, easy to prioritize, and the user stories that can be implemented in reasonable time in sprints if you're working in Scrum. So one thing to mind here is definitely the so-called INVEST criteria, the abbreviation that you see in the left part on the slide. Each user story has to be independent meaning that it should be possible to work on it independently and deliver it independently, to test it independently, and to discuss it independently. User stories should be negotiable, meaning that, again, user stories are not detailed software requirements. So there should be always a room for different ways to implement a user story. User stories are not solution focused, but are focused on the user needs. Each user story should be valuable for the end user. It should be possible, of course, to estimate it, and we prefer smaller user stories, reasonably smaller user stories, because it's easier to prioritize them and it is easier to plan the work of a development team working with smaller user stories. And of course, each user story should be testable, meaning the members of the development team should understand when the user story is done. So talking about how to split user stories, along which line, which splitting approach to choose, I would like to share two, well, maybe guidelines here or suggestions here. So one is preferring a split that gives you equally sized user story. So if you're splitting an 8-point user story into 2 4-point user story, this is preferable compared to splitting 8-point user story to a 2-point and 6-point user story, because splitting into equal sized stories allows you to prioritize easier and allows you to plan for your sprints again easier. So talking about splitting pattern, there are many of those, and in the links I have the like at the end of the slide deck there is a slide with the useful links. So there is a link to an article which lists 20 patterns of splitting a user story. I simply recommend to look into it and see, maybe you'll find there's something useful for your particular case. As a rule of thumb, it always makes sense to choose a split that allows you to, so to say, maximize the amount of work not done. So to get rid of some or deprioritize some of the functionality, because we all know that usually 20% of functionality achieves 80% of the outcome. So maximizing the amount of work not done is always, and achieving less, sorry, the other way around, of course, achieving more with less is always a good idea. One more thing that is always, which is often being discussed, is the scale of the user stories. So how big or how small should be a perfect story? And of course, such a thing like a perfect story does not exist. Again, user stories are tools for having conversations with the stakeholders, also tools for planning and prioritization. And depending on the application, depending on what you need to do with these user stories, you can choose a different scale. So here, if you look at this pictures on the right side of the slide, I would like to maybe refer to Jira. Of course, I mean, simply doing it because many of us probably are using Jira. Of course, user stories have nothing to do with the any concrete tool that you are using. It doesn't matter. Are you using paper cards? Are you using Jira, Trello, whatever? It doesn't really matter. But as many of us are probably using Jira, then I will just provide the hierarchy of tasks used in Jira as a reference point. So if we are talking about Jira epics, then probably this is a good scale of user stories to discuss with stakeholders, with the business stakeholders. So Jira epics or above than that, or bigger than that. If we are talking about the Jira epics and so Jira epics and tasks inside of this epics, this is a good format. This is a good scale to discuss user stories with the stakeholders and users. For example, during the focus group interviews, you can discuss with the users concrete details which can be expressed in the user stories at the scale of the tasks inside of Jira epics. And talking about discussing the implementation with the team members, then the tasks inside of Jira epics and subtasks are a good scale to explain the team members what is necessary to achieve, and a good scale for the team members to discuss the implementation and skip and split tasks. All right, let's move on. And let's talk a little bit about what approaches for creating user stories. So, of course, to start with, we need to identify our users, who is going to make use of our product, who is going to interact with it, and understand their key tasks. And there are different activities that you can undertake to do this well. So, of course, as long as you have such a possibility, you should talk to your users. So do user interviews. And as well, it makes a lot of sense to take the user lifecycle journey into consideration. So the activation, engagement, retention, churn, reactivation parts of this lifecycle journey. Looking into the user personas helps a lot, while is a useful tool for ideating product features, and helps a lot writing comprehensive user stories. And user story mapping is a great tool for creating user stories, and there is a link to describing this activity in the useful in the slide with the useful links at the end of this slide deck. Okay, so moving on, let's talk about what is helping a team, because it's a collaborative effort. Writing user stories is a collaborative effort, although usually product owner is accountable for writing user stories. What helps a team to write good user stories, and what causes troubles, what poses an impediment for writing good user stories? Of course, having a clear product vision is always helpful, and that also has an impact on understanding the needs of your users. The user is at the beginning of each user story, there is a user need. So understanding the user needs is crucial. Again, creating user stories is a collaborative effort. On one hand, this is a collaboration between the product owner and the stakeholders. On the other hand, this is a collaboration within the Scrum team, if you're working in Scrum, or between the stakeholder, the product manager and the development team. So, well, having good communication and good working relationships is always helpful. as well as having stakeholders on board. And also I would like to mention that having a diverse team composition, having people with different opinions in the team often helps to look at the user stories that might be even obvious, some functionality that might be quite obvious for some members of the team. Adding different perspective may change the user stories completely, the resulting user stories completely, and add a lot of value to the end user. Talking about the restrainers. So what are our impediments? What doesn't allow us to write good user stories, and what are the factors that we should eliminate in our work? So lack of alignment, definitely so, and failure to prioritize business goals. And a couple of more topics here. One that I would like to talk about is lack of the time for refinement, and this is because this is a very common restrainer, which is present in the work of many teams. We are always working under pressure. We have multiple, usually each development team has multiple stakeholders with different needs, and the stakeholders, of course, want more than a development team can deliver in a reasonable time. So sometimes that, and quite often actually, that puts pressure on the team, and that does not allow to devote enough time to refining user stories. And here it is important to, especially that puts pressure on the product owners or product managers. And here it is very important to the product manager for the product manager to remember that, again, user stories are tools for conversations, and it doesn't matter how fast you as a product owner understand a certain functionality, understand what has to be implemented, understand what would be the priority of one or another user story. It matters that your peers, the stakeholders, understand the benefits, understand the prioritization, the rationale behind this prioritization, and on the other hand, the team members also understand what is the user value resulting of this user story, what are the details of this user story. So it is very important to invest enough time. It's worth to remember that what matters is not how you as a product owner are fast understanding certain user stories, but whether your peers have enough time to understand the stories and prioritization. All right, so these are several, I think several sources that you may find interesting. And now, let's go back. Now I'm through with this short recap. The goal of this short recap was to basically refresh our memories and remind ourselves, so the fundamentals, what are the user stories, what are the formats, what is the purpose of user stories. And now let's move on. Let's go to the Miro board and look at the topics there and start the discussion.